In this video, we're going to look at this Tascam 234 Syncaset, a rack-mountable 2-unit 4-track multi-track cassette player, which I think must have come out in the tail end of 1983 because the earliest review that I can find of it online is from September of that year. The way I'm going to structure this is I'll go through my 5 key factors that I use to break down the differences between competing multi-track cassette recorders that you might find on Reverb or eBay. Then we're going to go through the features from the top left to the bottom right of the front and then the rear panel. Although there will be no audio examples or demos by the end of the feature overview section, somebody watching this should have a good idea of how to use the unit, and you can treat this review or guide as a video supplement to the manual. I'll talk a little bit about how easy it is to fix prices in the second-hand market, all this kind of stuff. Make some comparisons with other things you might buy for the same money. So, first key thing to consider when buying a multi-track cassette player is the size and weight. This is not very portable the way that, let's say, a Porta 03 or a Porta 02 is. This is a unit that's intended to be used in a studio situation. The rack mountable ears, by the way, are removable, but even if you remove those, it takes up quite a lot of desktop real estate. It weighs 10 kilograms. It's nearly as deep as it is wide. So if you're going to take it to a rehearsal room rather than leaving it in one room where you live, you're going to need a small suitcase really to move it about. The next key factor to consider is speed and whether noise reduction is available and whether it can be turned off. This unit is single speed, it is high speed, it is recording and playing back around a mean speed of 3 3/4 inches per second, equivalent to 9.5 centimeters per second. That's double the speed of commercial tapes that you would put in a Sony Walkman or a late 1980s car stereo. That means that although there is some sort of compatibility between the 4-track head that's in this and the 2-track head that you would have in a home stereo unit, in terms of the left and right channels will appear roughly on tracks 1 and 2, and the B side will appear in reverse on tracks 3 and 4. Those recordings are going to sound really high pitched and going to be 200% of the beats per minute. So if you're thinking that this might double as a substitute hi-fi cassette player, not so much. It is specifically for multi-track cassette recording. It comes equipped with DBX, and there is a switch where you can turn the DBX on and off. It's not defeatable on a per track basis, nor is there the facility to defeat just one track of DBX so that can be used for FSK or some other form of synchronization information. The next thing to consider is how many tracks can we record at once on this unit. We can record all 4 tracks simultaneously and any combination thereof. This contrasts with some units where you can only record 2 at a time. Without an external mixer, this unit lacks an ability to combine multiple signals and record them to the same tape track. You would have to have an external mixer, combine your signals into one bus and then connect that bus to the tape track. The 4th factor to consider is what kind of equalization, what kind of provision for insert or send effects. This occupies a kind of funny place because it is sort of standalone, like there are mic preamps on the back, and we have a basic facility to balance the 4 tracks of audio and to create a stereo image from a stereo Q bus with RCA sockets on the rear of the device for that. However, you're going to get the best out of it if you couple this with some sort of mixing desk. There's no equalization on board, nor is there any facility to insert effects into any of the channels or to send any of the channels in a wet, dry blend through an effects bus. Tascam are assuming that you're going to get those facilities from your mixer if you need them. And the final of 5 key factors is, are individual tape outs included? And the answer is, sort of. There are 4 line outs, each of which is connected to a separate one of the 4 tape tracks. The reason I'm saying sort of is that you would normally have nothing but a line level buffer between the tape head and the line out on any other machine that I've worked on. And this one, the line outs have the output dials between them and the output socket. It's not clear exactly what position on here is meant to be unity gain. From experimentation, I found that it was about there. but there's no indent or particular marking for it, and there's definitely a facility to boost the signal coming out of each of the lineouts, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just unconventional and quite confusing for me as a technician when I was trying to calibrate this. So let's go through the features from the top left to the bottom right of this front panel. We have an on-off switch. We have this timed ejection. And then we have a pitch control. If you don't pull it with a click this, the tape will play as close to 3 3/4 inches per second as your technician has calibrated it. But by pulling out, we can get plus and minus 12% on the speed, which is equivalent about 5 semitones in each direction. The cassette player itself is biased for use with Type 2 tapes, 70 microsecond EQ. Metal tapes and Type 1 tapes aren't necessarily going to do any harm, but in the case of Type 1 tapes, in addition to the lower responsiveness to high frequency information and higher noise floor that you get with those tapes anyway, a Type 1 tape will be receiving slightly too much bias, and that's probably going to result in a emphasis on low mids and even less treble sensitivity than the Type 1 cassette would otherwise be capable of. Also be aware that Type 1 tape will shed a bit more oxide on the heads, so you should be cleaning the heads regularly, even with Type 2 tape, but with Type 1 tape that becomes that much more important. I've never tried metal tapes in these because they cost so much. I assume that they're going to sound brittle, and it may be more difficult to completely erase them because the bias that they would be receiving from this is going to be too low. The cassette player is servo controlled. Under the hood we have 3 separate motors, one which raises and lowers the head array and pinch roller, another one which controls the winding of the reel tables, and a third one which drives the flywheel and turns the capstan. Because those mechanisms are not subject to force from over enthusiastic fingers, we have these clicky micro switch style buttons. That is meant to be less harrowing for the cassette. We can rewind, fast forward, stop, play, pause, which will raise the head array and the pinch roller without it quite touching so that the tape can turn, and then the record button. Erase, of course, is achieved by not arming any of the tracks and recording. Therefore, the erase head sends bias to the tape, leaving nothing but hiss, but the record head doesn't add any new information. We have 4 VU meters with peak LEDs. VU stands for volume unit. It's an averaging of volume over time. So depending on the source material, they may react differently. The example that's given in the user manual is that castanets might barely register on a meter like that, whereas an instrument with a much smoother envelope, such as a violin, its average level is going to show up much louder on these needles. The peak LEDs built into the VU meters, they're designed to be fully lit at 8 decibels above 0. This meter mode button changes whether we are seeing what's coming from the stereo output of the Q bus, that's with the button depressed, whereas if it's up, then each of the meters will show us either what is attached to input for tracks 1, 2, 3, 4, or what is coming back from tape from tracks 1, 2, 3, 4. Whether an input or an output is shown is dependent on the combination of buttons that we are pressing between this input tape sync button and function select buttons, as we'll come to. So for each input and track, we have an input dial and a dual concentric that is stacked control here with output on the center and pan on the outside. If we're thinking of a multitrack cassette recorder as a tape player in the middle of 2 mixers, the signal traveling from an input on the left with the tape player in the middle and the output mixer on the right. The input mixer is represented by these input controls, regardless of whether you insert your signal into the line-in RCA socket or 1/4 inch socket on the rear of the unit. This dial will need to be turned up or no signal will pass. If you're using the Q bus in this unit, which I would say is the post cassette player mixer on the right hand side of our mental diagram going from input to tape player to output, then this output dial will control how loud that signal is, either in our headphones or coming out of whichever device we have attached to the Q bus RCA output sockets on the back. If we have that Q bus set in stereo mode, it can be in a mono mode using the Q button up here. Then the pan control will place that signal in a stereo field. Often in multi-track cassette recorder design, if there's a pan control as part of the mixer, that would apply to the input part of the mixer as well, and then that pan control becomes a signal routing tool, allowing us to do things like combine multiple input signals to one tape track and so on. On this model, the pan controls are not connected to the input part of the mixer at all, so there is no facility to route multiple signals to a single tape track without an external mixer. But equally, there's no way to make recordings not work or be quieter than they should be by setting the pan control in the incorrect place. The only time that your pan controls on a 234 might change the way you were recording is if you were to do a bounce without an external mixer, which can be achieved by panning, let's say, tracks 1, 2, 3 to the left, and then on the rear of the unit we would connect an RCA cable from the left hand side of the Q bus and then route it into the input for track 4, which would need to be panned right to avoid a feedback loop, and arm track 4, and then that way we would be duplicating the information that's on 1, 2 and 3 in mono on track 4, allowing us to overdub this with more information and make a more complex recording. I will be demonstrating that method of doing ping-pong recording without an external desk when we move round to the rear panel. Turn the unit on at this point so that you can see the vacuum fluorescent display. Below the display, we have the DBX noise reduction system indicator. I'll just turn this on now so you can see it light on green. That shows that all 4 tracks have DBX engaged. Bear in mind that DBX is a 2-part process. So the DBX should be on during both recording and reproduction, or off during both parts of the process. You shouldn't mix and match or you're going to get results which are peculiar sounding, let's say. Here we have function select, which is a funny thing to call record arm, but that's what it's doing. This button arms track 1 for recording, this arms track 2 for recording, track 3, track 4. Depending on which part of the recording process you're doing, tracking or monitoring and balancing, you're going to want this meter and the output from your headphones or Q-Bus RCAs to give you information about what's coming from the input via this dial or what's playing back from tape via the output dial. And whether those VU meters and the Q-Bus are responding to the input or the output is dependent on how these 4 function select switches are set in combination with this input tape button and this sync input button. So most of the time we're going to be using this with this input tape button up in the tape position. In that position, then what we hear when we turn these output dials, what we see on these meters, what we hear through our headphone sockets or from the Q-Bus is what has already been recorded on tape. If this one is depressed, meaning that this red LED is lit, what that means is that the meters here and what we hear in our headphones and from the Q output on the rear of the unit is what is coming in on the line inputs or microphone inputs on the rear of the unit. Even if we were to press play in this mode, none of the signal is going to come through or appear in the VU. I would need to be in that mode for these meters to respond to the tape. I've got a test tone generator going into input 1. The other channels of this mixer are turned down, so we can only hear this one, and the input is turned up. At the moment I'm in tape mode. I've got tape in there, I won't say what it is. Hopefully it's so quiet coming out your headphones and so fast that I won't get a copyright strike. Now without this green sync light on, if I arm that track, I hear the input. With this, the track's armed, but I'm still listening to the tape until the moment I actually enter record. And I would do that by punching in, by pressing record at the appropriate place and then stop. Sync does nothing unless this is in tape position. You see if I push this in, depressing this button will not light that green LED. How would I use these in a practical sense? Well, if I was building up a recording from start to finish, so I'm starting with a blank tape, I'm laying down, I don't know, a percussion instrument, then bass, and then a guitar, and then vocals. Then I can hear my drums, and then I move on and overdub the bass. So I'm listening to my bass signal while I listen to the recording of the drum kit, and then I'd move on to this one, do an overdub, move over this one and do an overdub. Where this might be more useful is if using these memory controls, I'd set up a place where I wanted to punch in for one phrase of a vocal. Let's say it's on track 1. And then this isn't going to work because this tape's got the tabs in, but I would press, all right, I'm punching in. I'd press record again. The point there is that I could hear the audio that was preceding and following the place where I'm punching in. So this is a punch in rehearsal button really, and this is you'll never use it with that red light lit because you could just do that button is the way that I would explain that. We have a momentary style switch here, which will reset the counter. So I'll demonstrate that now with a tape in. Password stop, press that, it resets. We have a 0 return. The way these buttons work, this off button in the center will cancel either of these options, or you can switch directly between them. So if we turn this on to stop, if I fast forward it a bit, and then rewind it, we'll stop at 0. Whereas if I put it to play and then I rewind it, you can see that it's gone directly into play mode, and now we can see some of these meters moving. We also have one memory location, so if I press the enter button, we've stored 17. If I go somewhere else and I can't remember where I put that memory, I can press this check and that'll show me that it is at 17. And then we have similar off, stop, rewind options for the memory. And we can actually set up rehearsal in this way. So if I want to play the section between 0 and 17 over and over again for rehearsal's sake, then what I could do is set it to play at 0 and then rewind at memory. So if I first of all rewind this, when it gets to 0, it's going to play automatically. And then when it gets to 17, really for demonstration purposes, I should have chosen a number closer to 0. Right, here we are, and at 17, look, it's rewinding back again. And the process will continue until you stop it and defeat those controls. So I like that way of setting up the memory location. It's actually easier to understand and less cumbersome to program than some later models. And then finally we have this headphone socket, which changes how loud my potential copyright strike might be coming from the headphones that are over there. Here we are in the rear panel. As we go through these features, I will be talking about some of the limitations of the standalone mixer features. Bear in mind, most of those limitations are irrelevant if you connect this unit to a sufficiently capable external mixer. If we were to connect an external mixer, the outputs from the mixer would probably connect to these line-in sockets. If you didn't have the appropriate cabling terminating in an RCA connector, but you did have a connector that terminated in 1/4" plugs, you could go in through these mic instrument inputs with the gains all turned down. It would mean that the signal was passing through an extra op-amp stage. So I guess if you're the kind of purist that doesn't want your derivative indie song, which is eventually going to be listened to through earbuds in a lossy format, to pass through the contamination of another op-amp stage, then you're just going to have to pull up your big girl pants and buy connecting cables that terminate in RCA. Likewise, the lineouts would connect to 4 input channels on your mixer. You're going to have to set the controls on the front panel in the same way on each of the 4 channels. As I said earlier in the video, I think that unity gain is achieved by having the control not fully clockwise, but more of a kind of 2 o'clock position. So if I were to connect this to an external desk, there would probably be this extra layer of audio lineup where I ensured that each of the lineouts was producing a unity gain signal so that the extra output that's available from the internal mixer didn't alter the overall gain structure. The built-in Q bus would be redundant and you'd be relying on your external mixer for any connectivity issues like phantom power, XLR sockets, ping-pong recording, summing multiple signals to one tape track, send effects, insert effects, etc. So here is the noise reduction in-out switch. We can see that all these input sockets are unbalanced, As is typical for unbalanced equipment, these are operating at a minus 10 dB line level. That means that the average or nominal AC voltage that they're expecting is about 0.3 volts. If you've read around this a little bit, then you may know that older studio equipment used in professional studios in the 1950s, certainly through the beginning of the 1960s, used a plus 4 dB line level. This standard, which doesn't require noise cancellation in the cables, came about in the late 60s, and although it theoretically means that the noise from interference and so on could be louder compared to your musical signal, actually if you're using something like this in one room, you're probably not going to get that much noise pollution anyway, and it's going to be an order of magnitude smaller than the tape hiss or other forms of system noise that are coming from the recorder. So if you're thinking, oh, it's minus 10 dB and that means it's not professional, don't sweat it. Minus 10 dB is fine. Here we have the line outs, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're in reverse order so that they are lined up down the Z axis in relation to their corresponding VU meters. Bear in mind that a tape track is really a region on the tape itself, whereas a channel is part of a mixer. On this model, there's very much a one-to-one correspondence. Input 1 is for track 1, output 4 is for track 4. There's no way to route a signal from line in number 1 to tape track number 3, for instance. It's worth understanding that we can break input signals into 3 levels of amplitude. The quietest are microphones, then we have instruments with passive pickups like an electric guitar, and then we would have instruments like drum machines and synthesizers where their outputs are at or close to the line level that's expected by a device like this. So your drum machine or your synthesizer could be plugged into one of these RCA inputs or one of these jack socket inputs with the trim turned down, depending on what cable you had available. But microphones and instrument level devices, that is electric guitars, electric basses, things of that sort, we can add up to 50 decibels of gain to each of these inputs by turning that fully to the right. If you were to plug a guitar in, it would probably need less gain. If you're going to put in an SM57 or something, you're probably going to end up turning it most of the way to 9 o'clock in my experience. If you use an appropriately, that is professionally wired XLR to mono jack cable, you can use dynamic mics in these inputs no problem. There is no provision for phantom power. It's actually rarer than you would think to have a provision for phantom power on a multitrack cassette recorder. Usually we're dependent on using dynamic microphones or ribbon microphones, neither of which require phantom power. If we are using condenser microphones, then we might use a standalone preamp. Many of those include an unbalanced output that could be connected directly to one of these outputs. Although this unit lacks an ability to combine many input signals onto one tape track without an external mixer, I've been able to establish that we could plug into both of these inputs for track 4 at the same time. Let's say a drum machine's going there and a synthesizer is going there. Then we could use the output controls from those devices to set a balance between them, and a combination of them could then be recorded to track 4. Ditto, you could do the same thing, track 3, track 2, track 1. So provided that you're working with signals that are already at a line level, then in a pinch you could record up to 8 signals to 4 tracks simultaneously. These sockets over here, that's the left and right output from the Q bus. Bear in mind for this Q output that the button on the front panel that we discussed earlier controls whether we are getting a stereo signal or a mono signal, in which case both of these outputs would be duplicates of each other. And I suppose under some circumstances that might be useful so that you could send the same signal to 2 different places. The other thing I mentioned is that you can do ping-pong recording without an external mixing desk, provided you have a RCA to RCA cable like this. So to repeat the previous example, say I wanted to collapse tracks 1, 2 and 3 into a mono blend on track 4 so that I could then replace the material on track 1, 2 and 3 with overdubs, thus creating a more complex musical arrangement. What I could do is create a balance of tracks 1, 2, 3 that I think is going to sound good in mono, and then I pan them all the same direction. It could be right, it could be left. Let's say it's left. So that left output contains only our blend of 3 tracks. Then we push that into line input for track number 4. It's important that we would set track force pan control to be hard right. If we don't, then you've got a feedback loop there, so that would have to be panned in the other direction, but this signal would be passing to track 4 with no delay when we are creating a ping-pong recording. Here we have a remote punch-in out socket. Tascam recommended their RC30P footswitch. I've never owned one. I find that if you have a switchable polarity piano sustain pedal or switchable polarity guitar amp switch, then that works perfectly well in that situation. And then this remote control socket is for the RC71 remote, which is a long cabled remote, just allow you to start and stop the machine on the other side of the room. So let's talk about what this cost and comparisons with other things that you might buy instead. When this came out in 1983, the list price that was quoted in the archived review that I was looking at was £575. I used the Bank of England's inflation calculator, today being late August 2025, and according to that, that's about £1,967, which according to xe.com is $2,666 US. Now these are going for quite a lot of money. I've seen a few of these sell for £700 or £800, meaning that they've retained more than a third of their value. This is for service units, mind. And that's good news, I guess. If you're selling one, it seems a little bit questionable to me when you look at how much multitrack cassette recorder you could buy if you go to other models or other brands. If I'm looking at units that were available at the same time or shortly afterward, and I suppose I'm thinking specifically of the Tascam 244 and the Tascam 246, those units fetch a lot of money compared to functionally equivalent more recent units, but they're not as expensive in relation to their original list price as the Tascam 234 seems to be. And I suppose that's just a rarity thing because it's rack mountable. This is a unit that's got a very specific audience. Like if you've got your studio set up so that you've got rack furniture and you don't have a lot of desktop real estate and you're definitely not taking a 4-track somewhere else to record, then having something that is rack mountable and where you just connect it to your existing external desk that you've spent quite a bit of money on, well, I mean, it's sort of ideal. What else have you got to compare it to? Well, with the 238 that came out a lot later, which I'll talk about in a minute. At the time, Aria made one, didn't they? There's a few others that made basically functionally equivalent 4-track units. But I'm not aware of Fostex having made one, so you'd probably go for Tascam, wouldn't you? If you're that I've got rack furniture and limited space person, then I'm certainly not discouraging you from buying this. But if you're in the market for 4-track just on what is best value for money in terms of the most functionality and the best user experience, and that I include the best repair experience, then this becomes much more of an iffy proposition in my mind. For instance, if we compare it directly to a 244, it's about the same weight and size. I would say the 244 is maybe a little bit easier to carry around because it doesn't have so much in the way of sharp corners. Disadvantages? Well, you can't turn off the DBX on the 244, and it doesn't have a memory function, which the 234 does, but it does have tape outs. It does have send receive sockets. It's got an auxiliary bus, so you can add send effects. It's got a really nice parametric 2-band EQ, just a much better all-in-one solution. And then if you look at the 246, which isn't that much bigger than the 244, and is going for prices which are close to, but actually slightly less than this unit. I mean, it really does a lot more. You can turn off the DBX for just channel 4, so you can do synchronization stuff. It's got a 6-channel mixer with EQ. The memory system is more sophisticated. It's dual speed. It has all those effects blending facilities. If space and rack mountability were no object, I would say that I would rather work with a 246 attached to a big mixing desk than this attached to the mixing desk. Then if I wasn't using that in conjunction with my big mixing desk, I could take the 246 to a rehearsal room and I would still have a very capable mixer on hand. Speaking of the difference between this transport and the ones that are in the 244 and the 246, the flywheel is noticeably smaller and lighter on this model. Now, I don't have the kind of magic ears where I can hear the difference in flywheel weight, but I have noticed a trend where models with very flimsy flywheels are subject to more pitch artifacts. The flywheel that's in a 244, a 246, those are a significant clump of metal, like they're a bludgeoning instrument in their own right. Whereas this one is a bit lighter, so if you were using the flywheel as a sort of deterrent for home invasion, you would really have to resort to using the capstan as a stabbing weapon. The other thing I would say in favour of the 244 and the 246, both of which can be pretty difficult to access some parts of, depending on which part's gone wrong, is that if you've seen my teardown videos, like, this thing is a pain in the arse to take apart. The amount of disassembly that's needed to do just basic things like change a belt or change the pinch roller is really pretty massive compared to equivalent tasks on a 244 or a 246. I can't remember what I got to, but it's something like 12 different kinds of fastener, whereas most builds there's only 2 or 3 to keep track of. So that's not to say avoid it completely, but in relative terms, this is not one of my favourites to have to repair. It's awkward. I suppose this suffers in much the same way the 144. There's a couple of things that I find really difficult about that model. I don't know if it's the first one ever made. It's certainly Tascam's first rack mountable one. There were some decisions about layout which could have been a lot better, to wit, the Tascam 238, which, despite having more circuitry in it, is much, much easier to work on from a repair person's point of view. One of the lessons from IBM PC market, where a standard way to organise printed circuit boards is to have a motherboard and then vertically orientated cards coming in from the top. This is what was applied for the 238. 8 separate cards, 1 per track. That vertical orientation of the cards means that all the trim pots related to audio lineup are beside each other and clearly labelled, and that makes the setup of the machine a pleasure. On this model, the trim pots that we need to adjust are quite spread out and not very well labelled. Even the cassette player is significantly easier, although it is harder to work on than, say, the transport of a 488 or 488 Mark II. And so I'm going to say, if I was this aforementioned person that only had 2 units of rack space and no desktop space, and they just wanted a rack-mounted cassette recorder to use in conjunction with their existing desk, I would 100% get a 238 before I got a 234. There is an issue with track width and dynamics. Your dynamic range is poorer the narrower the tape is, and because the cassette's a fixed width, then when we go to 8-track we have less width. The thing is, though, we have limited dynamic range anyway because of the inherent noise floor of the medium. If you use DBX on an 8-track, it really doesn't sound that different to a 4-track recording on cassette. And another thing that I like about the 238 as compared to this is the 238 is just, I'm a tape recorder, don't ask me to be a mixer. Hindsight's 2020, isn't it? But I feel like if I could get a time machine and go back and be part of Tascam's team when they were building this, guys, let's get rid of the Q-bus. Let's have line outs and line in sockets which cannot be boosted or attenuated by controls on the front. Let's get rid of the mic level inputs. And instead of those, let's make it much easier to get into and maintain. Let's use that space that we freed up to have it so that we can turn off track 4 DBX individually and use the extra real estate that we freed up in the front panel to have a more elaborate digital memory system. I mean, essentially, those are the decisions that they made when they moved on to the 238. It would just be nice to have a 4-track version of that available, and for that to be easier to fix than this unit is, and available at a price which is kind of consummate with it not being a mixer. So I'm not criticising it. For the right person, it's definitely going to be the right item, but I would advise caution to anyone who's looking at this in a wider spectrum of multi-track cassette recorders, because it is pricey, it is awkward, and you do really need an external desk to get the most out of it.